This is the famous parable which talks about a king who's owed a debt by his servant, and that servant can't pay, so he goes down the food chain and oppresses his own servant. And 5 times in the parable it talks about paying. It says to pay 5 times. Pay, 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 pay. The Hebrew word for pay is shalem. So 5 times in the Hebrew it says shalem. Shalem, 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 shalem. Let's all learn that Hebrew word. What's the Hebrew word? Shalem. So 5 times it says to shalem, to pay. Then in the moral of the parable appears in verse 35, and there Yeshua says, so shall my Father in heaven do if you do not forgive each man his brother with a complete heart. And the Hebrew word for complete is shalem. Now, this is a classic Hebrew word pun that, just like in the example of Jeremiah, is intricately interwoven into the actual message of the parable. And without recognizing this Hebrew word pun, you're missing something. It's like that almond branch. You don't understand the connection there. In Hebrew, you immediately see the connection. He says it 5 times, and the 6th time it has a different meaning. Classic Hebrew word pun. Now, it's very clear that this parable must have been spoken in Hebrew, because this Hebrew word pun is intricately interwoven into the actual parable. So if this was translated from Greek, that would be an impossible coincidence. And you have many Hebrew word puns like this in Shamtel's Hebrew Matthew. We only looked at a few examples. Here's a word pun that actually appears in Greek Matthew. Greek Matthew 16:18. Yeshua says to Shimon, to Peter, he says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And this is a Greek word pun that appears in the Greek Gospel of Matthew. And based on this verse, many scholars have argued that this is definitive proof that Matthew wrote the Gospel actually in Greek. Matthew didn't write in Hebrew. He must have written in Greek because there's a word pun in the actual Greek text. Now, we've already seen 3 word puns in the Hebrew, and that's just a very small sampling. There's only 1 word pun in the entire Greek text. Now, let's look at the Hebrew and see what it says there. In Hebrew, Matthew 16:18, it says, you are a stone, and I will build my house of prayer upon you. Now, if you read this in Hebrew, you immediately see there's a word pun in the Hebrew. Because stone is even, I will build is evneh. Even, evneh, stone, I will build. That's a classic Hebrew word pun, 2 similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. Now, if this verse was a definitive proof that Matthew wrote the gospel in Greek, well, the very same verse has a word pun in Hebrew. So that proof falls away. Now, when I first learned of this, I thought, this is incredible. How could this be that the Gospel of Matthew was written in Hebrew? That's ridiculous. Okay, you bring me these linguistic arguments, but you can't just show up after 2,000 years and tell me the book was written in Hebrew. You have to have some kind of earlier evidence for this, earlier than Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut. And my first question was really, okay, the New Testament is preserved from the 3rd century and onwards in 5,000 manuscripts. And every one of those 5,000 manuscripts is in what language? It's in Greek. So how could Matthew have been written in Hebrew if there are 5,000 Greek manuscripts? And my next question was, okay, those manuscripts are maybe from a few hundred years after Matthew wrote the gospel. Maybe in the earlier period, there would be some type of testimony that would have to prove that it was written in Hebrew, maybe from one of the church fathers. And I said, okay, if Matthew was really written in Hebrew, how come none of the church fathers tell us that? And I actually investigated and found out that they do tell us that. They tell us that as a fact. Papias was one of the early church fathers who lived from 60 to 130 of the Common Era, and he's referred to as a disciple of a man named John the Presbyter, who you know as the author of the Gospel of John. And Papias, with his inside information, he says matter-of-factly, in the beginning of the 2nd century, less than 100 years after Yeshua's ministry, he says, Matthew collected the words in the Hebrew language. He states this as a fact, a universally known and recognized fact, that Matthew wrote his gospel in the Hebrew language. And he goes on and he says, and each translated them as best he could. That's very interesting, that second half, because what he's reflecting here is a recognition that it was a very difficult thing to translate this gospel from Hebrew into other languages, and everybody did their best. They might not have always been very successful, but they did the best they could to translate these things into other languages from the Hebrew. Well, let's look at some of these manuscripts of Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. This is a manuscript from St. Petersburg, the St. Petersburg manuscript. And Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew actually was published in 1987 based on the 9 manuscripts that were available at the time. This manuscript from St. Petersburg was at that time behind the Iron Curtain, and the Soviets wouldn't let anyone look at it. And it wasn't used when Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew was published. And because of that, the present publication based on the 9 manuscripts, is really an incomplete picture of what's contained within this document, because it wasn't based on all of the manuscript evidence. And this is really a fascinating manuscript, because this is the first time this manuscript is being seen in the Western world. The first time this manuscript is being shown here. This is an unpublished manuscript, and who knows what's contained in these pages. Now, when I went to look at this manuscript in Jerusalem, actually this is in St. Petersburg in the former Soviet Union, in the city that was previously known as Leningrad. And with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, a delegation of Israeli scholars went over to St. Petersburg, and they began to microfilm all the Hebrew manuscripts they could get their hands on, literally to photograph every single page. And when I went to St. Petersburg, when I went to look at the St. Petersburg manuscript in Jerusalem, I took it out, and when I brought it back to the librarian at Israel's National Library, he said to me a very interesting thing. He said, "Nehemia, was there anything interesting in that manuscript?" And I thought that was a very strange question. I'd looked at many manuscripts. I've never had the librarian ask me if there's anything interesting there. That's just not his job. And I said, "Why are you asking me that question?" And he said, "Because no one has ever checked out that manuscript to look at it before. This has been sitting in Israel for the last more than 10 years, and no one had looked at this manuscript. No one had studied it, quite simply because there are thousands of these Hebrew manuscripts that have been uncovered from the former Soviet Union, and it will take generations and generations of Hebrew scholars to study all these manuscripts and decipher them, and no one's gotten around to this one. It's simply, you can imagine that Hebrew manuscripts of New Testament books are not very high on the agenda of some Israeli scholars. So who knows what's contained within the pages of this manuscript? No one knows. Well, I know, but really no one knows because no one studied it. And what revelations of truth are waiting to be revealed by studying this document? Here's another unpublished manuscript, which is the Breslov manuscript. This is also originated in a city in Eastern Europe in the former Soviet Union. However, today this manuscript is not in Breslau. It's actually in Prague. And there's a very interesting story behind this unpublished manuscript as well. In the 1940s, the Nazis ransacked Europe looking for Jewish artifacts, Judaica articles of artwork and manuscript and Torah scrolls, anything they could get their hands on. And they brought them all to Prague, and they set them up in a museum which the Nazis called the Museum of the Extinct Race, because the goals of the Nazis was to make the Jews extinct. And actually, to this very day, that's the largest collection of Judaica in the world, this former Museum of the Extinct Race. And who's extinct today and who isn't? That's a testimony, I think. We're still here. This is a